just when you win a national championship, it is immortality. And that's what we were chasing. We were chasing immortality.
That's right. The Bearcats ate them up and took care of business this weekend. That was Sam Houston State head coach Casey Keeler after Sam Houston with a thrilling come-from-behind win to take down South Dakota State and win the FCS National Championship, the first in school history. Congrats to Sam Houston State. Welcome, everyone, to the latest installment of the Fox 26 Sports Stream. As always, I'm Sal Manine, sports producer here at Fox 26. As we got a lot to get to tonight, because even though the Rockets aren't playing in the NBA playoffs, which begin with the play-in tournament tonight, right now, I guess you could say the first game really is over, even though there's a fourth quarter to play, as the Pacers have stormed all over the Hornets. There's still a lot to get to, not just with the playoffs, but the Rockets, as they held a post-mortem, if you will, after their season mercifully came to an end on Sunday. Just 17 wins in this 72-game campaign for the Rockets, but they believe that they're positioned to get through a rebuild rather quickly, turn themselves into not just a contender, but a team that's going to be competitive in that pursuit of getting back to NBA contention. So we'll get into what GM Rafael Stone and head coach Stephen Silas had to say, and then a little later on, Mark Medina from USA Today, longtime NBA writer, will join us as he gives us a bit of the national perspective on not just the playoffs, but how everybody else in the league views the Rockets and what they are trying to do in the post-James Harden era. So I mentioned season ends with a 17-55 record. Rockets are set up for as good a chance as you can to get a high draft pick. Let's take a look at the NBA draft odds. Remember, they changed the rules a few years ago, so it's not the team with the worst record who gets the most ping pong balls. It's the three teams with the three worst records will all share the same chances of getting the number one overall pick. So Rockets, Pistons, and Magic all with a 14% chance of getting the number one overall pick. You'll notice the asterisk, though, when it comes to the Rockets and drafting fifth overall. If Houston does not remain in the top four in terms of lottery picks for the 2021 draft, they have to send this year's pick, their own pick, to Oklahoma City as part of the Russell Westbrook trade from a few years ago. So as you see, basically a 48% chance that the Rockets end up with the fifth pick. So just over 50-50 in terms of the Rockets actually keeping their pick, after that's what this season, unfortunately for Houston, came to be because of the rebuild on the fly and so many injuries. Rockets set a record this year in terms of number of guys who actually suited up and played for them. That was something that Stephen Silas even joked about today, that he didn't even know a lot of the guys in terms of didn't get a chance to meet some of his players or even see them play in person until they showed up on that game day and were thrust into a quick shoot around or a meet and greet with guys, but then had to go out and actually play minutes for the Rockets because they had so many injuries this year. So that's what it all comes down to for Houston, as they try to find the next piece that they can build around. We've talked about it a few times before. Here are the prospects that everybody is chasing in the NBA draft lottery. Different people around the league say, oh, it's only a 5-person draft, 7-person, maybe not even that many guys, if any, in this draft that are true game changers, franchise changers, along the likes of a Zion or a Luka Doncic. Obviously, still too early to tell, though. That's what they said back in the 2013 draft, that it was just abysmal. And look, when it started with Anthony Bennett being the shocking number one overall pick, and you go back and you look, there are a lot of misses from that draft, and you're certainly not going to confuse it with 03 or 1984, but that's the draft that yielded Giannis Antetokounmpo. So just because everybody says, oh, it's not a very strong draft, or there's not going to be a guy who goes in the top 3, top 5 that's going to completely change your fortunes, you never know. Cade Cunningham from Okie State looks to be the presumptive number one pick, but obviously it's only the middle of May, so still a ways to go before any team, especially the Rockets, we'll know who they're drafting and where they're drafting. So let's get into what we heard earlier today from Houston and their brain trust as far as what their plans are as they enter the offseason and what they hope to do, not just with their draft picks, because, yes, it's kind of in limbo as to whether or not they're going to keep their own pick and be able to pick in the top 4, but they still have multiple draft picks late in the first round this year. And then, of course, going forward, because of the James Harden trade, Houston is going to have multiple picks in multiple drafts, some of which aren't even their own. So let's start with a little bit from Rafael Stone, the new general manager for the Rockets, just wrapped up his first season in charge after taking over for Daryl Morey. And here's why he thinks that Houston right now just needs to continue what they've done over the past year since he took over, and that's accumulate assets, be it draft picks or young guys who they can hope to develop, like Kevin Porter Jr., KJ Martin, Jayshawn Tate. Here's Rafael Stone.
We need talented basketball players. We need really good basketball players. We have some, and I think some of the guys we have a real opportunity to get better over the offseason. One thing that I was hoping we would get at the stretch, which we did not get, was I was hoping we would get enough help to really get a sense for what the team looked like intact, and we never got that. So, but it probably wouldn't have changed anything for me anyway, or for us collectively. We're just going to try and bring in the best guys we can, whether that's through free agency or the draft. I just think you find the best basketball players you can and make it fit.
You have to remember that Rafael Stone studied under Daryl Morey before he was elevated after Daryl left to join the 76ers. And what was the philosophy of Daryl Morey when he was in charge of the Rockets? Accumulate as many assets as you can, and then at some point you hope to flip them into something bigger. Or in a perfect world, they turn out to be a Ben Simmons or Joel Embiid, as was Sam Hinkie, another Daryl Morey acolyte, as was his thinking when he was in charge of the 76ers. So that's what the Rockets are hoping to do, not just with their draft picks, but they need to see, and you heard Rafael Stone allude to it, they need to see that these guys who showed flashes, especially late in the year, is there was a lot of playing time to be had for some younger guys who perhaps on last year's team or on a team that had more veterans, that was healthier, probably wouldn't get some run. What you saw from KJ Martin, what you saw from Christian Wood, what you saw from Jayshawn Tate, is that something that's sustainable? Can those guys continue their development and become pieces, especially when you talk about Kevin Porter Jr.? Is that now not just a complementary piece, somebody who's a part of your rotation or the third or fourth option on your team, but can Kevin Porter Jr. be somebody who you build around? Remember, this is a guy who dropped 50 points before he got hurt and had to shut it down for the rest of the season. And when you look at the list of guys as young as he to drop 50 plus, it's it. He's the youngest player in NBA history to put up a 50-point game like he did. So that's what the Rockets going forward, starting with this offseason, it's evaluating the young guys that they have, that how much of it is, all right, there really is something there. This is something that they can sustain and continue to get better at. How much of it is good stats, bad team type of thing. But either way, Rafael Stone believes that with the assets they've started to accumulate, these young guys and these draft picks, he sees Houston as putting itself in position to be able to take that proverbial next step whenever that time may come. Because remember, in today's NBA, just because you look and say, oh, well, such and such a player is under contract with this team, or he doesn't become a free agent for another 2 years, or there's no way that the Brooklyn or any other team would want to break up their superstars or their big three. If I had said that to you a few years ago, that Kawhi Leonard was going to leave San Antonio, that he was then going to leave the team that he just won a world title with, that Paul George, who had just signed a max deal with OKC, was all of a sudden going to be available via trade. Even just look at the Rockets. That's how they acquired James Harden in the first place, that it wasn't until the eve of training camp that all of a sudden OKC said, we can't afford to pay this guy and Serge Ibaka. Next thing you know, the Rockets end up with one of the greatest players of all time. So that's why Daryl Morey started the thinking and why now his successor in Rafael Stone believes you just put yourself in a position and eventually something's going to pop. Here's why Rafael Stone thinks that Houston is an attractive destination for whoever the next group or young draftees may be that come to Houston.
I think the reality is that Houston's like an amazing city that is well known in the NBA. It's a destination city in the NBA, and I'm hopeful that people end up. I'm positive that everybody in the NBA likes Steven, and I'm hopeful that people like for the most part like me. And so I think that this is a really attractive destination. I think now having said that, again, we're really committed to really building something that gives us a chance to win a championship. So we're not just packaging a bunch of picks to try and barely make the playoffs for a year or two. That's not the goal. We're really trying to build something sustainable and with players who can be good now and great later. That's for sure the goal. But I'm not actually concerned about people wanting to be here. I'm confident that we're going to have people who really want to be here.
It's only a matter of time, though, and that's the tightrope that the Rockets organization has to walk. At what point do you pull the trigger on whether it's a big trade, packaging some of these young assets, or that you luck into one of the many draft picks that you have turning into the next great superstar? Remember, before the Rockets got James Harden, there was this 3 or 4 year period where Houston was kind of stuck in limbo, where they would barely get over 500. They'd be in contention for the 8th seed until the final week or last 2 weeks of the season. And they had this great supporting cast. They just didn't have anybody to support. They had a wonderful bench, all kinds of young prospects. Remember, it was the Rockets who at one point had a young Goran Dragic and a young Kyle Lowry and so many great role players like Luis Scola or Chuck Hayes, who they had all the pieces, and unfortunately the Yao and T-Mac experiment didn't work because of injuries, but the Rockets were just kind of hanging there in limbo, and then the opportunity presented itself to package so many of those assets and trade for James Harden, and we all saw how that took the franchise from being stuck in mediocrity, or maybe even mediocre is not the right word. They were a good team, but not a great team, and catapults them into NBA title contention, which, yes, they obviously did not win the title or even make the finals with James Harden. But how many Houston fans would much rather be in the mix, in the conversation, saying we have a chance right now, as opposed to sitting on their couch watching the Lakers, the Clippers, the Sixers, all these other teams, and knowing that you are nowhere close to the playoffs. So let's get one more in from Rafael Stone before we bring in Mark Medina on just why he feels that this is not going to be a lengthy rebuild for the Rockets, nor does he think that this is going to be a 76ers trust the process type situation where you're going to be looking at a whole lot of 16, 17, 18 win campaigns going forward. That, at least in the minds of the people who run the Houston Rockets, they think that they are set up to still be competitive while trying to build themselves into title contention.
We're kind of abandoning the strategy of intentionally trying to be bad for 5 to 10 years or whatever it takes. We're not trying to do that. I think that's the biggest difference. We're trying to compete. We're going to be young. We're not trying to like press it immediately, which I think has also been good. I think the teams that do that sometimes make quick mistakes because you might bring in a free agent, pay him a lot of money that isn't kind of quite the guy just because that's the guy that's available in that year. And we're going to try and avoid those types of mistakes. Like, we're not going to be perfect. Not every transaction is going to work out, whether because of fit or injury or whatever else. But we're going to do the best we can. We're gonna try and put a competitive product on the court quicker, and we're not we're not worried that we need our draft pick to be as bad as possible or as low as possible in any given year, because we do have some other picks that we expect will come to us in the future.
All right, let's delve more into the Rockets and the NBA playoffs, which for the first time in 9 years do not involve the Houston Rockets. With USA Today NBA writer Mark Medina, what's going on, my man? How are you?
Oh, I'm doing well now that I get to catch up with you and talk some hoops. Hope you're hanging in there.
Yeah, it's been a crazy season on the basketball court, especially here in Houston. You were on that Zoom call earlier today where we heard from Rockets GM Rafael Stone and new head coach Stephen Silas. Can you kind of give people a sense around the NBA, what the perception of the new look Rockets that have kind of had to rebuild on the fly, basically everybody under Tillman Fertitta is in a new role or brand new to the organization? As you talk to different people around the league, what's kind of their outlook on Houston as it enters this rebuild?
Well, it remains to be seen. I mean, the outlook that people had around the league during James Harden's trade demands was, hey, this is just the final chapter of what has been a pretty hot mess, to say it quite frankly, where, just months prior, they were a team that had a chance to win a championship, and they had that window in recent seasons. But all of a sudden, Daryl Morey's leaving, Mike D'Antoni's leaving, Russell Westbrook's getting traded, James Harden wants out. And so there was this feeling, this all connected to a larger picture with ownership, with Tillman Fertitta, where there wasn't that same synergy in terms of every person's philosophy, and also a feeling that a lot of decisions were made because of cost-cutting reasons as opposed to putting the best product on the floor. But since then, it's been kind of a blank slate. Everyone knew was expecting the circumstances that the Rockets were going to be in a rebuilding season. Or in related news, they had the worst record in the NBA. And so now it's just a matter of how well can they develop guys and what can they do moving forward. And that remains to be seen. I think the encouraging thing that Rafael Stone mentioned on this Zoom call is he's trying to leave all options open. And they have draft assets. They have some decent young players. They have John Wall, who's a good veteran player. But it remains to be seen what fork in the road they're going to take. Are they going to be about just doing the slow rebuild and rebuilding guys, or are they going to be aggressive? And Rafael Stone is saying he's going to be aggressive, but he's not going to make moves that's going to be an overpay for a free agent and just give them a window to be in the playoffs for 1 or 2 seasons. It is about the long term. So I know how this plays out in real time can become complicated. So we'll have to wait and see.
And I think it's important to remember Rafael Stone is a Daryl Morey acolyte. And that was Daryl Morey's philosophy all those years ago, was just acquire assets anyway, anyhow, young players, draft picks. And then they were able to turn it into James Harden and turn the Rockets into that title contender. What do you see if Houston is able to keep its top 4 pick? Because obviously if it falls to 5 or lower, they have to send it to OKC. What do you see as a possible path? Is it what you just mentioned, just bring in as many players and then hope for a superstar to be disgruntled or injured or something, and you can trade for the next James Harden, so to speak? Or is there a guy in the draft or coming up the pipeline that you think, if I'm a team rebuilding like the Rockets or any of the other teams at the bottom of the standings, this is how you try to get yourself into contention, similar to what the 76ers did the last few years?
Yeah, I don't think anyone in this draft is a game changer and is a face of the franchise. And I think historically, when you're looking at draft picks, the way to accelerate a rebuild is using that draft pick in a trade. And so that is very well an avenue that the Rockets could take. They also have a handful of free agents, I believe 8, that have to decide what their future is going to be. And I think that goes hand in hand. It might be the Rockets determining that or the market determining that. And so I think if the Rockets want to be on that faster pathway toward rebuilding, it's using that in part of a deal. But I think the question is, what can the Rockets get in return? Stone was pretty bullish that he thinks that there are, star players that want to play with the team, but you kind of have to rewind a few months ago. There was a star player that didn't want to be with the team in James Harden. There was another star player with Russell Westbrook that didn't want to be with the team. And in fairness to the Rockets situation, their want to be out had to do with previous circumstances. And right here, the Rockets are a little bit on a clean slate, but there's also a lot of question marks that they have to answer. I think that the top two things are, realistically, how good of a young core is this group? They showed a lot of promising signs, I think most notably with Kevin Porter Jr., but I think there's also something to be said that, look, when you're on a losing team, guys are inevitably going to get their numbers. What does this mean in helping teams win games? And I think that then the other unanswered question is, what's the future of John Wall? What's the future of Eric Gordon? Those are really good players. But with John Wall specifically, he's had some injury issues that have emerged once again. And so while I think the Rockets were pleased with his play and his leadership, most notably with how that pertains to Kevin Porter Jr., again, there might be this fork in the road where they have to decide which lane they want to take. And that's a really challenging job that Stone will have to navigate.
You've obviously been covering the league for many years. What's become somewhat of a concerning trend in recent years has been the movement of so many superstars. A year ago this time, if I told you that James Harden and Russell Westbrook were going to be demanding trades, you might look around as Houston was going into the bubble and getting off to that hot start and thinking, well, is that no way that happens? But we saw it even a few years prior with nobody thought that Paul George was on the market. All of a sudden, he's an LA Clipper. What do you make of this idea that contracts and long-term planning almost doesn't matter anymore? Because, we're sitting right here, whether you're talking about the Rockets or the Knicks who rebuilt themselves almost overnight, that all of a sudden, a year from now, 2 years from now, it can be a completely different outlook in terms of where guys are playing.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the Rockets are a case study of how that can work in a team's favor and how it can also hurt them. And I think it's not going away. I think philosophically, I'm all about player empowerment. I'm also about teams doing what's in their best interest because they have an organization to run. So with the Rockets, I mean, just think about how it benefited them. The Oklahoma City Thunder didn't have the cap space, or at least willing to spend with keeping James Harden, but the Rockets had a lot of assets and cap room to get Harden. That helped create the pathway into getting Dwight Howard and then trading for Chris Paul when his time with the Lakers or the Clippers, it felt like that was expiring. When the Chris Paul and James Harden pairing had some challenges from a health standpoint and chemistry standpoint, Daryl Morey went in and getting Russell Westbrook. So that has helped the Rockets in the past, but as we've seen this past year, it can also hurt them because you're one superstar away from, having to go from a rebuild again. And so I think that where the Rockets go from here is, what the Brooklyn Nets did with getting James Harden and, by extension, Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving in the first place. Focus on player development, having a good coaching staff, a good culture around it, and the players will come. I think that as much as large markets may still have some financial advantages in the lure of being in a big city, those factors aren't as well in play as they once were. Maybe they still have more margin for error to screw things up. But I think that smaller market teams still have a pathway into being a really good franchise if they have really good ownership, a really good synergy with the front office and coaching staff. And I think that the recipe is in place for the Rockets to have that. Look, it is a blank slate how good of a GM Rafael Stone will be. But as you mentioned, he learned under Daryl Morey. Stephen Silas is a first-year head coach, but he didn't come out of nowhere. He was a very respected assistant with the Dallas Mavericks before that. He was a big reason why they were one of the most prolific offensive teams in the league. He's had other coaching experiences working with the young Steph Curry in Golden State. And so I think the feeling is, given the circumstances that Silas was under this year, he did a great job in, threading that needle with focusing on player development, having a positive attitude, but also having some sort of accountability. So I think as much as there is a lot of uncertainty with the Rockets and challenges ahead, having that good foundation with the coaching staff and the front office is a good sign. And I think that another example of them being on the same page is just by virtue that they had a Zoom call together. They were sitting step in step. Usually with any professional team, if there's any philosophical differences, a head coach and the GM, they're doing separate exit interviews. They're not sitting at the same podium. But we'll have to see how that plays out, because with NBA teams, talent prevails ultimately. So it'll be an interesting offseason, to say the least.
I want to transition and talk about the playoffs, which are already underway with the play-in tournament. What's been your perception as just somebody who covers the league about the play-in tournament? But I guess more importantly, when you talk to different teams, players, coaches, now that this seems to be a thing that we're going to have, at least in the short term. I remember a year ago when they first got to the bubble, everybody was like, oh, wow, this is new. This is different. This is cool. Then all of a sudden the Lakers find themselves in a play-in game, and now people are pumping the brakes, so to speak. What's your take on this new approach? And when you talk to people around the league, do you think this is going to be something that is just a part of the NBA playoffs going forward?
Yeah, well, regardless of how the players and the coaches and the teams feel, this is something that is going to be going forward. The league's implemented it. It got passed. And I think, the answer to this question, some of it has to do with varying degrees of self-interest. I know in the bubble, when I talked to teams about what they thought of the concept, the top seeds thought it was fine. I mean, it didn't affect them. There were teams like Portland that thought it was really good because it helped them get into the playoffs. And then there are teams like the Memphis Grizzlies that were thinking, this isn't the best. And there were some coaches, whether affected or not, that still adhered to the tradition of, hey, you should reward teams that know how to navigate an 82-game schedule. But I think that there are also coaches that are mindful of, look, the last few weeks of the regular season almost became pointless to watch and meaningless for teams. This is creating more excitement. And I think that's what the league is looking at. But that being said, I understand even when you account for the varying degrees of self-interest, why there has been pushback on the play-in tournament specifically to this season, because of the condensed nature of the schedule, it being 72 games, the challenges of this year with navigating the pandemic and all the health and safety protocols. But I think moving forward, once things get back to relative normalcy where there is the traditional season, I think it's a good thing. It's going to add more reason for viewers to tune into games, add more reason for teams to want to have competitive games and have a chance to play those games with purpose, as opposed to either positioning your guys to rest before the playoffs or positioning for your guys to tank so you can get a lottery pick. So I think by and large, I like it, but I also understand some of the challenges that go with it.
Obviously, the bottom would have to really fall out for the Lakers to fall completely out of the mix. But let's say that they do take care of business and they're in the traditional playoffs. What is the feeling? And I know that you're based out on the West Coast with, obviously, the last 2 years, LeBron James has had to deal with injury, or the last 3 years deal with injuries. That's a first for him. Anthony Davis, we know his injury history. When this team's healthy, we saw what they can do, not just going back to last year, but at the beginning of this campaign. But if they still have question marks, if you're not getting your two biggest stars at 100%, does the West become wide open? What do you make of the Lakers as they get ready to try to defend their title?
Yeah, their fortunes, it's a very simple answer, but also a very complicated answer, that their championship fortunes hinge on how healthy LeBron James and Anthony Davis are. And I think that leaves their identity in kind of a conflicted state right now. I mean, the play-in tournament aside, where anything can happen, especially against a Steph Curry Warriors driven team for his greatness. I think once you get in the first round, they're vulnerable in the short term because LeBron James is still knocking off the rust, as is Anthony Davis, to a lesser extent, Dennis Schroeder. And I think in theory, the Lakers could become more dangerous later on in the playoffs because now they have more games to get together as a unit, to shed the rust off, to get healthier. But as far as their health, it can cut both ways. Let's start with LeBron James with his high ankle sprain. Before his return, when I talked to outside medical experts, their feeling was that as long as he's not rushing back, he's going to be fine, even when you account for age and the unpredictable nature of injuries. And he took 20 games to come back. And I think where the gray area for why LeBron was still struggling with his injury was that because of the untraditional, the lack of a traditional schedule this year where he had enough practices to get into scrimmages, ramp it up, he had to test it out before the game. And so I think that it might be inaccurate to say he had a setback because he just didn't have that ramp up capability as he would have in normal times. And so now is the litmus test. After playing 2 games, he sat out for 6. He had some practices under his belt. Is he finally removed from all the lingering effects? And so far, so good, but you never know. Anthony Davis, I think that there's more optimism because even though his injury is considered more serious, he was out for an extended period of time. He's had more games to get his conditioning up to speed. But as you mentioned, he has an extensive injury history. And while he's had a track record of being able to get up off the floor quickly and not miss a lot of time, you just never know. And so that leaves the Lakers in a really interesting and precarious situation entering the playoffs.
Let's say that everything goes right for the Lake Show and the 2 big stars do remain healthy. Even Dennis Schroeder, you mentioned, will play a key part in them trying to repeat as champs. If the Lakers are at full strength, are the Clippers the only realistic shot at knocking them off in the West? Or is what we saw this year from the Utah Jazz and from the CP3-led Phoenix Suns, is that for real? Because I have a hard time if LeBron and AD are healthy, as well as the Jazz have played, and I love Donovan Mitchell's game. Quinn Snyder's been at this a long time as a top-tier NBA coach. Everybody knows about Gobert's defense. I still have a hard time seeing the Jazz beating the Lakers with a healthy LeBron and AD 4 times in 7 games.
Yeah, I think the Utah Jazz and the Phoenix Suns are the real deal, but here's the reality. The separation that the Lakers have with a healthy LeBron James and Anthony Davis is just still wide compared to the rest of the field, even including the Clippers. So it's not so much a knock on those teams per se. They've had successful reasons for doing the right things, but as long as LeBron and AD are healthy, they have shown that they're still the top 5 players in the NBA. Now, that's a huge caveat, number one. Number two, I think that even if they are healthy, they could still be vulnerable against the Brooklyn Nets in the NBA Finals. But that also has to be under the assumption that they're fully healthy with Kevin Durant and James Harden and Kyrie Irving. And with their track record, that hasn't been proven because they've only played a combined 7 games this season. So while I don't think that that is a huge cause for concern of their lack of games playing together because of their experience individually, I think it is a concern of how many more times are there going to be new injuries that pop up. And so I think whether we're talking about the Nets, the Lakers, or in any other team, I think we almost have to assume, because of this unconventional season and the times that we're in, that it's not going to be a level playing field. There's going to be extenuating circumstances that pop up for any team. And I think that's what makes this very challenging, makes it very unique. And also, I think from an NBA fan standpoint, it's going to make for very entertaining basketball.
You brought up the Nets, so let's turn to the Eastern Conference. On paper, if you were playing 2K, you would go, all right, the team with Harden, Kyrie, and KD is easily winning the Eastern Conference. But as you mentioned, we've only seen them play a little together. And even when they do all 3 play together, I still have questions about this team's defense having to navigate an Eastern Conference where you could be facing Giannis, the 76ers. The Knicks could be a tough out even in that second round for the Sixers. So I still feel like if the big 3 for Brooklyn are not 100% together and healthy, that there's a few different teams that could make some noise in the East. What do you look at going into the Eastern Conference playoffs?
Yeah, going to the Eastern Conference, I'm ranking Brooklyn number 1, Philadelphia number 2, Milwaukee number 3. I think those are the only 3 teams realistically that have a path to the NBA Finals, and the separation and talent level with those 3 teams through the rest of the field is still pretty stark. But again, we're also dealing with unprecedented times where the number 1 factor in determining NBA championship health is even more precarious, even compared to normal NBA seasons. So with the Nets specifically, I know that there's definitely different question marks about their defense, the chemistry with all 3 players. But I think that throughout the season, the Nets have, for the most part, shown that while they'll never be an elite defensive team, the effort is still pretty respectable, and they have enough offensive talent and depth to overcome that weakness. And then number two, I've been on record having a lot of skepticism on how the chemistry was going to work, specifically with James Harden and Kyrie Irving. I have a lot of optimism with Kevin Durant because of who he is as a player and his experience blending his all-star talent with other teammates with the Golden State Warriors. But I think James Harden has exceeded my expectations from that standpoint. So I don't have necessarily question marks on the chemistry, but again, health is such an unpredictable scenario that they are vulnerable compared to Philadelphia and Milwaukee, but they've also had their own set of challenges with Philadelphia. Can Joel Embiid stay consistently healthy? That's always been a thing that he hasn't fully been able to account for. I think Milwaukee has turned a corner with its consistency, with Giannis being a better player. I think Drew Holiday is one of the best defensive players in the NBA, and that was a great move that the Bucks made. So we'll have to wait and see. But if I had to put money on it, I still see the Nets getting to the NBA Finals because talent has a way of being able to take care of all those other weaknesses on a team.
It's certainly going to be interesting and a lot of question marks that people in Houston will have plenty of time to debate and ponder since their team is not in the postseason. Mark, I'm going to get you out of here on this one. Last one is we appreciate your time with us. Which do you think conceivably happens first? The Rockets get back to the NBA Finals and win a title, or Dre drops Detox?
I wish that Dre would drop Detox sooner, but I don't think that's happening. I've been waiting for over a decade, and it seems like it's a lost cause. So, yes, if the Rockets are trying to lean on any sort of optimism, let it be known that it's not going to be taking as long as it does for Dre to put out records. And I think on a more serious note, when we're looking at a rebuild, I don't sense, based off the Zoom call that was going on with the Rockets and overall, that the Rockets are trying to mirror this Philadelphia 76ers from year past where they're just intentionally tanking. I think that they are trying to build a culture and focus on player development and also be aggressive with what could happen on the trade market. But I think at the same time, they're also trying to guard against trying to throw away all their assets at once just for the sake of maybe getting a second tier free agent that could help them become somewhat competitive next season. I think it is all about the long view, but it is also not about tanking and just not having a good product out on the floor. But those are very complicated factors and variables to navigate in real time. So it'll be interesting to see how it actually plays out.
This is why he's one of the best, the keen insights, not just into the NBA, but on Dr. Dre. One day, hopefully, follow it up on his promise to bless us with Detox. You can read him in USA Today. Follow him on Twitter and social media. He's Mark Medina. Thanks, my man. Take care and enjoy the playoffs.
Hey, Sal, you're one of the best. Appreciate you as always.
Again, thanks to Medina, who might be the biggest Dr. Dre fan I've ever met. If you peruse his Twitter timeline, I think you can see just how much he loves the good doctor and why he should stick to writing and not trying to rhyme. Here again are the draft lottery odds before we get out of here. Rockets tied with the Pistons and Magic for the best odds to land the number one pick and likely Cade Cunningham, but barely more than 50% chance of finishing in the top four and getting to hang on to that coveted number one or first round pick, high first round pick. Otherwise, 5 or lower, that pick goes to Oklahoma City. So that's going to do it for this installment of the Fox 26 Sports Stream. The Astros are out west, which is why we didn't get too deep into them, but they began a critical series in less than an hour now, just about 45 minutes. First pitch at Oakland between the A's and the Astros, tied in the loss column. So a golden opportunity for the Stros. I'm a big believer in baseball really doesn't begin, or you really can't start drawing too many conclusions until you get to Memorial Day. And look, we're right around the corner from that. And the Stros are back above 500, winners of 6 in a row, 8 of their last 10, and have a chance to own sole possession of first place in the AL West before this weekend arrives. My thanks again to Mark Medina for joining us. My thanks to everybody who joined us on fox26houston.com, on our YouTube channel. That's where you can catch us every Tuesday night at this time. And of course, as always, for up-to-the-minute updates on everything in the world of sports, be sure to follow our sports director, Mark Berman. He is at Mark Berman, Fox 26. I'm Sal Manine. We'll see you again next week.